It does not happen on the day she leaves. It does not happen a week after either, while the relief of finally having space is still fresh enough to feel like proof she made the right call. Regret arrives later, on a day that looks completely unremarkable from the outside, usually one where nothing about you is even present in her life anymore. There will be no warning, no trigger she can point to, just one ordinary afternoon where something she's been avoiding finally catches up to her all at once. Here is what almost nobody explains about that exact day. It has very little to do with missing you specifically. By the middle of this video, you will know precisely what actually happens on that day, and why it arrives so much later than either of you would expect. I know this day because I watched it happen from both sides. The side that finally walked away, and years earlier, the side still waiting for regret that never seemed to come on schedule. Once you understand what actually has to happen inside an avoidant woman, before regret is even possible, you stop needing her timeline to match yours. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what triggers that day, why it takes as long as it does, and what it does and does not mean about how she felt about you. Here is what catches most people off guard about this. You expect regret, if it comes at all, to arrive close to the ending, while the memory of you is still sharp and immediate. It almost never does. It arrives much later, once the relationship has faded into something closer to background noise, because regret requires a kind of clarity that only shows up after enough distance has passed to see the whole shape of what was lost. You have probably imagined this day already more than once. Maybe you picture it arriving fast, within weeks, her suddenly overwhelmed with realization the moment the dust settled. Maybe you pictured it never arriving at all, convinced she is simply someone incapable of looking back with any real weight. Maybe, if you are honest, what you actually picture is somewhere between a slow dawning she never quite lets herself finish, catching a feeling and setting it back down before it becomes something she has to sit with. But here is the part almost nobody explains about the actual day this regret shows up. What finally triggers it, and what you assume triggers it, are rarely the same thing. If that sounds like it is building toward the idea that she is quietly falling apart somewhere, waiting for the right moment to come find you, stay with me, because that is not where this goes. This is not a video promising regret leads back to you. This is about the actual psychological mechanism behind when and why this day happens, so you understand it clearly instead of guessing at a timeline that was never yours to predict. To be clear, this is not a video telling you her eventual regret proves the relationship was a mistake to end, or that it means nothing at all either. This is about naming exactly what has a shift inside her first, because that shift explains far more about her than it does about what you two had. Let us get into it. The first thing to understand is that regret cannot arrive while she is still inside the relief of having left. In the early weeks after distance or separation, an avoidant woman's system is usually flooded with something closer to relief than grief. The pressure finally lifted, the closeness finally regulated back down to a level that feels manageable again. Regret requires the opposite condition. Enough time and enough distance for that relief to fully run its course, and for the absence to stop feeling like freedom and start feeling like simply absence. That shift alone can take months, sometimes far longer, because relief is a powerful anesthetic against anything underneath it trying to surface. The second thing to understand is what specifically breaks the relief once it finally starts to wear off. It is rarely a single dramatic realization. More often, it is accumulation, a string of ordinary moments where something reminds her of a specific ease she has not been able to find with anyone since, a small gesture, a particular kind of steadiness, the feeling of being fully known without having to perform for it. Individually, none of these moments mean much. Stacked over enough time, they start building toward a comparison she was not consciously running, one where the present quietly comes up short against the past she has mostly stopped thinking about on purpose. Here's where most people misread this timeline entirely, in one of two directions. Some assume the absence of visible regret early on means it will never come, deciding she is simply built without the capacity to look back with any real feeling. Others assume the opposite, convinced that because enough time has passed, the regret must be coming any day now, and spend months checking for signs of it that were never going to arrive on a schedule anyone else could predict. Neither read holds up, because regret on this timeline is not a countdown. It is a threshold, one that depends entirely on her own internal pace, not on how much time feels reasonable from the outside. Because here's what rarely gets said plainly enough. The exact day this regret finally lands is less a single moment and more a threshold she crosses without noticing she has crossed it, usually triggered by something in her current life falling short in a way that finally makes a comparison impossible to keep avoiding. Picture how this actually plays out in real life. 2 years after everything ended, she is at a dinner with someone new, someone stable, someone who by every reasonable measure is good for her. Halfway through the evening, he says something ordinary, asks a simple follow-up question about her day, nothing special about it at all. And for half a second, without meaning to, she compares it to a version of that same ordinary moment with you, one where the question came without her having to explain why she needed it asked in the first place. She catches herself doing it, feels a flicker of something she cannot immediately name, and pushes it down before dinner is even over. That flicker, repeated enough times across enough ordinary moments like this one, is what eventually builds into the day the regret finally lands. It rarely announces itself. It just keeps quietly stacking until one day it does not go back down. There is also a second layer sitting underneath that first moment, and it tends to arrive somewhat later than the initial noticing. Once the comparison becomes impossible to avoid entirely, what often follows is not longing for you specifically, but a colder recognition aimed at herself, a realization that the ease she is missing was not circumstantial. It required someone specific showing up in a specific way, and repeating it with someone new is not guaranteed simply because time has passed. That recognition is often heavier than any single memory of you, because it is less about what she lost and more about what she now understands she has to actually work for if she wants to feel that way again with anyone. This is where the difference between genuine regret and a passing wave of nostalgia becomes visible, though the two can look similar at first. Genuine regret tends to produce change. A woman who starts examining her own patterns more honestly, who approaches the next closeness differently, because something about losing you actually registered as a lesson rather than just a loss. Nostalgia produces nothing but the feeling itself, a wave that rises, gets acknowledged briefly, and passes without altering anything about how she shows up afterward. Telling these apart matters, because only one of them indicates anything about whether she has actually grown from what happened. Here is a distinction worth sitting with directly, because it changes what her eventual regret is actually worth. A woman experiencing genuine regret rarely centers on you specifically. She centers on the version of herself who did not know how to stay. A woman experiencing surface-level nostalgia centers it entirely on you, on what she is missing, on the specific comfort only you provided, without any accompanying reflection on why she could not hold on to it while she had it. The first version tends to produce real change in her future relationships. The second tends to produce nothing but an occasional wave of feeling that fades again just as quickly as it arrived. Which brings up the real question worth asking here. Not, will this day eventually come for her, but what will she actually do with it once it does? Because the regret itself proves very little on its own. It is simply a threshold crossed, and what she does on the other side of it, whether it becomes fuel for real change or just another feeling she buries the way she has buried everything else, is the part that determines whether it means anything at all for you or for whoever comes after you. Here is what matters most if you're the one she will eventually think of on that day. That day arriving is not proof that leaving was a wrong decision, and it is not proof that you should have stayed and waited for her to catch up either. It is proof that what existed between you was real enough to eventually be missed. Once enough time passed for her to see it clearly instead of the fog of relief that followed the ending. You did not fail to be enough while you were there. You simply were not able to control when she would finally have the clarity to recognize what she had. So there are two honest paths sitting ahead of you here, and neither one requires that day to arrive on any particular timeline. If some part of you is still tracking whether this day has come for her yet, the honest path is not pausing your own life to wait for confirmation that she finally understands what she lost. It is continuing to build a life so solid that her eventual regret, whenever it lands, simply becomes something that belongs entirely to her story, not something you needed to complete your own. If you have already released a need for her to ever fully understand it, the honest path is not requiring her regret at all to feel at peace with how things ended. It is trusting that some understanding takes years to arrive, and that you are allowed to be finished long before she gets there. Both paths are valid, and neither one requires you to keep watching a door for a knock that may or may not ever come. Because the goal was never to make her regret losing you. The goal was to become someone whose worth never depended on her eventually recognizing it. So that whatever day this regret finally arrives for her, it changes nothing about how solid you already are without it. And that is exactly where you are standing right now.